Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاح الخالد عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاح الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا،
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان، عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان، عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية،
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. I hope that you enjoyed the compulsory beginning of the show there with the great Ewan McCall and the Ballad of Stalin. And that, of course, is an entirely fitting way to begin the program due to the fact that we are looking at some of the legacies of Stalin today. It would be, of course, impossible to fit in all of the legacies and all of the ways in which he helped develop the science of Marxism-Leninism. So we are going to be looking at, over the course of the next hour or so, some of those legacies and the way in which this has been, of course, distorted. We'll touch on that and why it has been distorted. And we are doing the stream, of course, to catch up on the catastrophic technical failure that afflicted us the other night, which hopefully we have gotten over now. And I hope that at the very least you can all actually hear me. Nobody wants to be doing a mime act for 20 minutes or so. So we will, of course, start our program by doing a customary roll call through the chat. And just before I do that, I will say that two things that we have coming up over the next few days. So on Saturday of this week, we have the Patreon show on the review of the Dune movies. So that's the 1984 forgotten classic by David Lynch, which actually looks even better after seeing the two Villeneuve films and the two Villeneuve films. And I may bring in some elements of the early 2000s show as well, which starred James McAvoy, I believe. So I may touch on that as well. So that's on Saturday of this week, precise time to be advertised later today. On Sunday of this week, we have the Q&A, which is where I go through comments, questions, and expressions of interest that have been sent in to the email address, which is just you can find in the YouTube description box, or comments from YouTube videos, comments that have been submitted on Patreon, and I'm doing that on Patreon on Sunday at midday. And that'll be from midday until around about 2 or possibly 3 in the afternoon. So the way in which things are going to work going forward is that wherever I can do a couple of streams a day, I will do, just to take into account the fact that we have a bit of a global audience now. So I want to be able to talk to as many people live as possible. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and schedule these streams as far as I possibly can in advance so people know where they are. So without further ado, I'll say keep an eye out for all the stuff coming out over the weekend, and we'll get to the those who are in the chat today. So we have James Graham, we have Tom, who says ni hao, and I say ni hao back to him. We have Lisa and Ian Foster. Good morning to you, comrade. Lisa comes to us from beautiful Hull, Massachusetts. Interesting. Early start for you over there. Calmo joins us from the Great English Northwest, and Sean joins us from Cornwall. We have Raziel coming to us from the southeast of England, and we have C. Bolt coming to us. Tobias, good morning to you. HM, who says, morning. Listening whilst doing my menial work. Well, I hope we're alleviating the menial nature of the tasks somehow, HM. Frank joins us from California. Good to have you with us, Frank. And Eamon O'Sullivan joins us from Ireland and says, hello, comrades. Greetings from Ireland, where the working class are an afterthought. Victory to the workers of the world, indeed. We have Dan Lindstrom with us, who says hello, and we say hello back to him. We have Dr. Ahmed, who joins us from Egypt. Good to have you with us. And Munis, who's with us, and Martin, who's over in Vienna, and apparently it's rather cold there today. And Seabolt says the sound level is good. HM says, I saw Dune 2 last night. I fell asleep. Not sure if my tiredness or the film was to blame, but I think both, to be honest. I mean, I didn't fall asleep in it, but I was watching it on an IMAX screen, and I was sat. To be fair, it was a packed out IMAX screen. It was in the middle of the day as well. So I was sat right down the front, so you're basically in it, and I'll come to this in the review, but that's the best way to watch it. I realize, of course, not everybody can watch it like that, because the only really impressive things about it are that it knows how to use CGI in certain ways that are positive. It uses CGI in a lot of other bad ways. I mean, there's some elements of it that where the graphics end up looking like a crowd scene from a PlayStation 1 game. But we'll come to that in the review. But certainly, just to give a bit of an advance on the review, certainly the scene where the character of Paul Atreides rides the sandworm for the first time and has to capture it, that on an IMAX screen where he's tumbling through a collapsing sand dune onto the worm, and the combination of the IMAX screen and the sound design and the way they shoot it, that's all done brilliantly. So I have to give credit where credit is due on that one. But as I said, more to come on that at the weekend. So we will then proceed. And first thing to ask or say is, well, it's a question really, which is what defines the difference between a revolutionary and a social democrat? Now, of course, this is bearing in mind that the social democrat term, and you see this in Stalin's own writings, used to, of course, refer to the positions and the politics of those who we now refer to as communists. So bearing in mind the terminology in terms of what it means, both the content and the form has changed. But so let's use the term social democrat and communist now as defined by our current era. So what is the difference, the real difference between a communist and a social democrat? The answer is, I think, if we have to boil it down to one answer here, is the way in which they view the role of the masses. I think that is the crucial difference. There are many others, of course, as well. But I think the core of it lies in the way in which they view the role of the masses. Now, with someone like Stalin or Lenin or Mao, they managed to theorize this and practice this in terms of the role of the masses in a way that is almost unrivaled. But the crucial thing to understand here is that the revolutionary, the communist, in the truest sense of the term, sees the role of the masses as not being merely something which is ceremonial or something which is the masses are there to do the May Day parades and then they go back to their homes again and wait for the announcement of the Central Committee. No, the way in which a revolutionary views the role of the masses is that the masses are there to rule. They are there to play a constant and evolving an ongoing role within the governing of the state, of the workers' state. And that is clear and obvious in much of what Stalin wrote and indeed did. So that is the crucial thing to understand when it comes to what defines the Stalin's approach to politics and the politics of the workers' state that was the early to middle period Soviet Union. It's also what defined Mao's understanding as well, and of course Lenin's. Now, of course, all of this wasn't just an expression, as Lenin's critics would have had it, of Lenin's anarchism. Lenin, and following on from him, Stalin and Mao, all understood that the role of the masses couldn't just be some sort of wild and uncontrolled burst of energy, that this was something that needed to be organized properly. It needs to be something that needed to be led via the cadres, or if you prefer the Gramscian terms, the organic intellectuals of the working class, who are those within the party, needed to be the ones organizing and leading the masses. But that without the constant involvement of the masses, then the revolution withers away and dies. And that is why I would say that a figure like Hugo Chavez, or indeed his successor, Nicolas Maduro, or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, properly qualify as revolutionaries, even though, of course, these are still countries which haven't moved beyond capitalism. They are the revolutionaries, in my view, because Maduro and Ortega, and to a certain extent Evo Morales, though there's certain differences there, but certainly Chavez, Maduro, and Ortega all understand that without the constant activity of and support of and the intervention of the masses in the political process, in the political life of the country, in the building of the Bolivarian Republic in Venezuela, or the ongoing revolutionary process in Nicaragua, without that there is nothing. They understand that without the involvement of the masses, the mass politicization of the working class and peasantry, without that, then the US imperialism would have killed off both revolutions a long, long time ago. Chavez was radicalized by the process of his removal from power, but also the way he was brought back to it. In 2002, in the televised coup, as Maduro observed recently, it was the first coup that was on television. Now the Israelis are doing the first live-streamed genocide. But the coup in 2002 is crucial to understanding the development of Chavez as a political figure, and his successor, Maduro, as well, in that who brought them back to power, who saved Chavez from what would have been a very early death. It was the masses themselves. It was the Venezuelan working class, particularly, that came out in their hundreds and hundreds of thousands into the streets of Caracas to terrify the bourgeois coup plotters into surrendering and giving up. Now, the role of the masses has been enhanced ever since then, and the only reason that the Bolivarian Republic survived the coup plots of the Trump era and the Biden era is because, of course, the masses are constantly involved in the running of their own communities. They're involved in democratic expressions via the community assembly movement across Venezuela, and these are, of course, this is of course a movement now which has produced its own national guard, which, under a decision made by Maduro a few years ago, is armed. Similar process in Nicaragua. So that is the reason I would say that someone like Maduro or someone like Ortega, despite the fact that capitalism and capitalist relations survive in both those countries, those are both men are far more revolutionary than any Trotskyite or any anarchist in the Western world. Might seem self-explanatory, but what you see in the critiques of Venezuela and Nicaragua is that, oh, these men aren't revolutionaries, capitalism has survived there, etc., etc. But both men understand and embrace the role of the masses in pushing the revolutionary process forward. And in that sense, both men are far more revolutionary than any Communist Party leader in the West since 1945. Certainly that's the case. But to go back to the point that we're making here, which is why am I dwelling upon the difference between a social democrat and a revolutionary? And I think this is how we must understand the vilification and demonization of Stalin by the imperialists, and of course by Trotsky and by the Khrushchevite revisionists in the USSR. It is the difference between a revolutionary and a social democrat. That is why those who followed him, personified by Khrushchev and his clique, demonized Stalin so much, because Stalin understood the role of the masses in the revolutionary process and knew that the masses had to be constantly mobilized, not just in defense against the external enemy, although that was done to a heroic extent in the Great Patriotic War, but also against the internal enemy. And the internal enemy isn't just the foreign spy or the saboteur, the paid agent of imperialism. It's also the enemy in terms of the that which develops inside the hierarchy of the party and the state. And Stalin understood that the way in which, of course, they were having to build socialism inside the Soviet Union meant that the state and party had to be subject to constant criticism and constant holding to account by the masses. And without that, there always was the risk of degeneration. And what you see from actually reading Stalin's writings on these subjects is that he had a profound understanding of the potential weaknesses in the Soviet system. And that the remedy for this was, of course, the consistent intervention of the masses. And it is that which, more than anything else, Khrushchev and his clique had and desired to kill off for good. That's what they needed. That's what they needed to destroy. And I'll just read to you a little bit of text that popped up on a Telegram feed that I followed the other day. Now, this is I follow this rather interesting character on Telegram. It's by the name of Alexander Galushka. And Galushka is an interesting figure because he's someone who's listened to by the Kremlin, by the Russian leadership at the moment, and he's an ardent defender of the 5-year plan process that ran between 1929 to 1955, and he's an ardent defender of Stalin and his legacy, which is interesting given that this is a guy who has very much open door, it seems, to meetings with Putin and also various others in the hierarchy of the Russian state. Now, he made a number of interesting observations on his Telegram channel the other day upon the anniversary of the death of Stalin. So I'm going to read to you the translation from the Russian here. If there's an error in the translation, it's mostly a machine translation. I've tried to correct certain words that didn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I think this is a close enough translation to make sense. So I'll read the whole thing to you. At 8 o'clock on March the 5th, 1953, a meeting of the country's leadership takes place, at which key decisions are made on fundamental changes in the public administration system. The terminally ill head of state, that's Stalin, is deprived of the post of the chairman of the government. The bureau of the presidium is abolished within the structure of the government itself. Ministries and departments are being enlarged more than 3 times. For example, the Ministry of Higher Education, the Ministry of Cinematography, the Ministry of Labour, the Committee for Arts, the Radio Information Committee, the Glas Polygraph Izdat are united into one department. The Ministry of Culture. The Ministries of Light Industry, Fishing Industry, Food Industry, Meat and Dairy Industries are being merged into one department. The Ministry of Light and Food Industry. Gosnab is being liquidated. Gosnab was a key organising, integrating body that ensures real-time horizontal connectivity between enterprises in various sectors of the economy and the control of supplies. At the time of its liquidation, Gosnab ensured the supply of products up to 3,000 product items. The importance of this work is evidenced by the fact that out of several dozen members of the government, the heads of only 2 bodies, Gosnab and Gosplan, are part of the highest political leadership. All decisions are made unanimously by this group without discussion. This meeting lasts 40 minutes, and after 1 hour 10 minutes, at 21:50 in the evening, Stalin dies. As a result, public administration becomes chaotic, a discrepancy between the content and complexity of the management and the structure of the subjects of management arises, and the specialisation of ministries is undermined. Such a reorganisation of the work of government disorganises the entire process of public administration. In general, after March the 5th, 1953, an intensive process of constant, chaotic, convulsive, contradictory changes in government and public administration begins, which lasted more than a decade. So, what can we tell by going through Galushka's statement there, which is all true? Those reorganisations did take place. So what is the significance of Gosnab, and how does it relate back to what I was saying about the difference between a revolutionary and a social democrat? Now, Gosnab was the unit of the Soviet government that was used to, as Galushka argues, to assign resources and ensure connectedness between the different state enterprises in the country. and the control of supplies. So without a market system, without the market system, you have to replace it with, of course, the state planning process. So you had Gosplan, which was part of that, and then Gosnab, which is the resource allocation part of that. And this was absolutely crucial, because without that planning capability to actually assign resources via the various different elements of the national industrial infrastructure, then the system became completely chaotic, as Galushkas critiqued their states. So it was, Gosnab was the replacer for the market system. And it worked, as Galushka and other modern Russian writers have argued, it was actually an incredibly efficient resource allocation machine. And I will go into the functions of Gosnab and Gosplan in later episodes. But I want you to bear in mind, again, what is the purpose of this particular episode now. So, the difference between a revolutionary and a social democrat. Why does Khrushchev do away with Gosnab? Well, there is an argument to say that Khrushchev was a moron who didn't understand anything that he was doing, maybe. But also, what's the crucial change that Khrushchev brings in? It is the reintroduction of market relations. Admittedly, in a mild form at first, but you get things like the privatization of the tractor stations that service the state farms. You get the fracturing of the planned economy on a national basis. So it used to be that through Gosnab and Gosplan, the Soviet economy was planned on a countrywide scale. And what I mean by that is, it's one of the consistent features of the Stalin period is he kept emphasizing the need to bring up the level of all the different parts of the Soviet Union together, so that industrial development wasn't just concentrated in one particular area. So that the 5-year plans that were constructed from the late 1920s onwards, of course, these were initially centered in terms of building up areas that were already industrialized from back in the period of the late Tsardom. But Stalin kept emphasizing the fact that the nature of the planned economy had to be such that the areas like Soviet Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all of these areas were brought up to, as far as was possible, the same level as European Russia, as what's now Ukraine, as Western Russia. And the reason why you want to do that, of course, is because you, of course, need to have, partly it's about overcoming the historical backwardness of these areas, growing the proletariat, making sure that the largely peasant countries that have been part of old Tsarist Central Asia were brought up to the same level both industrially and culturally as the rest of the country. And that meant, of course, that under the planning process, you had to essentially construct the system in such a way as that you were prepared to run industries in areas of the country that capitalists would never wage them in, would never actually put them in. They were prepared to build industries in areas of the Soviet Union that didn't naturally fit there. They did so in order to essentially develop the underdeveloped parts of the country. Now, this all tails off under Khrushchev. Why is the question. Now, the answer to this is complicated, but I think that one of the great insights that is provided on this particular question is provided by Ludo Martins in his book, The Velvet Counter-Revolution, when he looks at, well, what was the motivation of the revisionists? Now, he correctly, Martins that is, makes the point that the Khrushchevite revisionists, as with any political grouping, were motivated by various different things. Now, yes, some, a small minority of them, would have been outright traitors, people who had either fallen into completely pro-capitalist points of view, agents of US imperialism. Those people would have been present, almost certainly. though the number of direct agents of US imperialism, I think, is rather hard to tell. But there would have been most likely a small minority who were, either directly or indirectly. So there's them. There's others who are, and this is the much bigger group, who are more representative of what I would call the social democratic deviation, which is, and these were probably the biggest group post-Stalin that dominated the hierarchy of the Soviet Union, unfortunately. And these are people who, some of them came from the sort of Bukharinite right-wing tradition. Some of them were more on the left, but they were social democrats in the sense that they didn't see or didn't want the masses to have an ongoing role in process of running the Soviet state. And Martins identifies these people as possibly the dominant group in the Khrushchev and the Brezhnev era, though there's the precise strength of this group ebbs and flows. But these are the biggest group. This is the group that probably supports Khrushchev more than any other, and then eventually swings to Brezhnev because Khrushchev proves too chaotic. But their motivation is that they want to see a system that is, as they would say, more stable. And this is behind their hostility to Stalin. They are hostile to Stalin for the reasons we're about to go into in terms of Stalin's approach to solving political problems that he identified. Now, the idiot who's only ever read, Kotkin or Robert Conquest will say, Stalin just killed people. No. Stalin's approach to overcoming problems in the bureaucracy was to mobilize the masses. This is why when people claim that, Mao invented the idea of the Cultural Revolution, well, he took it a little bit further, but the idea of the masses being needed to be mobilized against recalcitrant, useless, bureaucratic elements within the system, that idea goes back to Lenin, and it's an idea that Stalin was very much on board with and, in fact, did a lot to develop. And so what is the purpose of Khrushchev's 1956 speech? It's to draw a line under the revolutionary period, to say, mainly to the imperialists, it must be said, but the motivation for the group that is around him, again, partially informed by outright traitors, mostly, though, informed by a hierarchy that wanted an easier life and wanted easy answers. That's the crucial way to understand this, unfortunately. I wish it were the case, in many respects, that the way in which Khrushchev can be defined is just as an agent of the US. I wish that were true, because that's a much more, it's a more damning story in many respects, but it's a story that's easy to tell. The actual reality of people like Khrushchev, and I would say even a wretched scumbag like Gorbachev, is that they were just fools. They were undereducated, politically useless, lazy in some respects. Now, Khrushchev was a very energetic administrator, but he was a man who did not take the time to develop his point of view in terms of philosophically and theoretically. As Molotov observes, it was an error that was a fundamental error made in the later Stalin period, was that the hierarchy of the party stopped being subjected to as much pressure from the masses as it should have been, and stopped theoretically and politically developing themselves. And Khrushchev personifies that. Khrushchev's decisions always give away what his motivations are. And it's that he's a guy chasing easy answers. And he's a guy who's pathologically afraid of the role of the masses. And those are the two things that defines him: opportunism and fear. Opportunism in the sense that he always seeks the easy answer. So why does he do away with Gosnab? And why does he move away from the state planning system that had been so successful for the period between 1929 to 1953? Well, he does so because he's been presented by opportunists who existed within the Soviet state structure with a plan that says, well, if we Comrade Khrushchev, if we institute market relations in, should we say, the agricultural sector, we'll see productivity go through the roof. Well, Comrade Khrushchev, if we institute some market relations and do away with the overly bureaucratic, remember the pro-market guys from Bukharin onwards always couched things in terms of the planned economy was too bureaucratic. Now, just as a side note, the number of bureaucrats that currently exist within the modern state machine of the Russian Federation is significantly higher than those that existed in the RSFSR, the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, at the time of the Soviet collapse in 1991. There's more bureaucrats now than there was in the late Soviet period, even with all the innovations in automating tasks and the supposedly anti-bureaucratic revolution of the Yeltsin period. There's more bureaucrats in the modern Russian state than there was in the old Soviet state. So it was never about an anti-bureaucratic revolution, but a fool like Khrushchev would believe that. So they'll say, Comrade Khrushchev, we can, using this brilliant plan that we've designed, come up with a system for improving food production. We'll be able to increase consumption, personal consumption by 18%, say. If we just give the agricultural workers more individual motivation or something like that. It'll strengthen socialism, Comrade Khrushchev, trust us. And of course he did. This is the biggest thing. Like, Khrushchev was, I genuinely don't think, an active, he wouldn't have considered himself to be a traitor. He was worse than that. He was an idiot. And when you look at his approach to imperialism, first of all, he clearly didn't understand it. Second of all, because he didn't understand it, and because he was, again, looking for an easy answer and looking for a non-revolutionary answer, then he saw it in terms of, well, if we just make some concessions to them, maybe we can calm things down, which is what that's what that speech in 1956 is all about. It is about Khrushchev virtue signaling to US imperialism. Well, we can calm things down. We're not revolutionary anymore. We just want to develop the country. Now, of course, he swung wildly from one direction to the other after it turns out that imperialism then kicked him in the nuts and basically said, well, yeah, that's nice. We're still going to try and relentlessly destroy you anyway. But this is the thing to understand. Khrushchev and his group were principally social democrats. They were animated, domestically speaking, by a desire to close off the revolutionary process, to stop the masses intervening. And they were supported by a phalanx of officialdom inside the party and the state machine who wanted to get away from the revolutionary period because it meant an easier life for them. That's the unfortunate reality. And they were supported also by very naive people who saw some of the things that Khrushchev said, and of course his references to, oh, well, Lenin said this, and they bought into it. But that's the biggest thing. This is the biggest difference. And this is where we must now turn to, of course, the writings of Stalin himself. And I'll come back to the dreadful consequences of Khrushchev's sock-dem deviations later on. So I'm going to read some elements now of the a contribution made by Stalin to a Congress of the CPSU in the 1930s. And this is entitled On Problems of Organizational Leadership, and this is from the report, Stalin's report to the 17th Congress of the CPSU-B in 1934, and this is from this book, which some of you may have available. You can get it from the CPGBML party shop online if you want to. I'm sure there's an online version of it available as well. But here I want to read some extracts of this to you. Excuse me, in order that you can see the crucial differences between a revolutionary and a social democrat. So, Stalin starts off in this work. Bear in mind, this is from the middle of the early period, I should say, of the 5-year plans. They've just gone through the first 5-year plan. They are developing the second. And Stalin's commenting in this work on well, what are the problems of the leadership of the party and the leadership of the state? What is confronting us now? What are the crucial things we have to address? So, first point to make here, and I'll read this quote to you from Stalin. He begins as follows. Some people think that it is sufficient to draw up a correct party line, proclaim it from the housetops, state it in the form of general theses and resolutions, and take a vote and carry it unanimously for victory to come of itself, spontaneously, as it were. This, of course, is wrong. It is a gross delusion. Only incorrigible bureaucrats and red tapists can think so. As a matter of fact, these successes and victories did not come spontaneously, but as the result of a fierce struggle for the application of the party line. Victory never comes by itself. It usually has to be obtained. Good resolutions and declarations in favour of the general line of the party are only a beginning. They merely express the desire for victory, but not the victory itself. So, what is Stalin saying now? Well, fairly self-evidently, he's speaking against what you would call bureaucratism, stating that you can have a correct position, you can have the correct line stated, it can be voted on and endorsed, but unless there's an active struggle to actually pursue that, to relentlessly seek to enforce it via actual concrete actions, then you're doing nothing but bureaucratism. I'm sure we've all seen that in various fields of work we've all done. But this was a problem that, again, Stalin was following on from Lenin. He was following on from Lenin's warnings about bureaucratism that might creep into the Soviet state earlier on in some of his last writings. Now, Stalin goes on to say the following thing, and I think this is going to be crucial to understand the difference between Stalin and Khrushchev. Quote reads as follows. As a matter of fact, victory was achieved and won by stern and systematic struggle against all sorts of difficulties that stood in the way of carrying out the party line, by overcoming the difficulties, by mobilizing the party and the working class for the purpose of overcoming the difficulties, by organizing the struggle to overcome the difficulties, by removing inefficient executives and choosing better ones, capable of waging the struggle against difficulties. What are these difficulties and wherein are they lodged? They are difficulties attending our organizational work, difficulties attending our organizational leadership. They are lodged in ourselves, in our leading people, in our organizations, in the apparatus of our party, state, economic, trade union, Young Communist League, and all other organizations. So, what does Stalin actually mean there? He's speaking in plain language, as he often did. He's identifying correctly that one of the major problems is the fact that you have this bureaucratism, and the only real remedy for it is to be able to not just swap out executives and members of the hierarchy who are failing in their position, but to wage a consistent political struggle. And again, Mao is often credited with this realization, but it's clearly there in Lenin, it's clearly there in Stalin as well. I don't think Mao would ever have claimed to have invented this, but he did develop it further in terms of the Cultural Revolution. So after the revolution has been achieved, after socialism is being built, after the workers' state has been created and has moved on and secured itself, again, a consistent struggle must be waged. Why? Because, and again, this is something that all of the great revolutionaries understood, there is always in any system a pitfall, a potential flaw. You're never going to get a system which is free of human frailty. And the frailty in this case is the frailty of bureaucratism. And it's not just jobs worth stuff. It's the bureaucratic empire building. It's what you might call arse covering. It's all kinds of dubious stuff that the bureaucrats get up to. So the way in which you have to consider this in terms of the hostility of later Khrushchevites is that Stalin consistently, through the 5-year plan process, mobilized the masses in support of it. Through collectivization, the Soviet leadership, not just Stalin, but all of the Soviet leadership, made appeals directly to the peasantry to mobilize themselves in a struggle for collectivization and against the kulaks. The actions of the Soviet state at each turn were based upon the need and the recognition of the need to keep the masses as a absolutely fundamental part of the process of building socialism. That if socialism became a set of bureaucratic diktats, then it wouldn't be socialism anymore. Then it would easily collapse. Because without that consistent involvement of the masses, then there is no socialism. You can't reach socialism, again, by administrative measures. You can reform via administrative measures, but the fight for socialism is of a qualitatively different thing. So the way in which we have to understand how this generated Khrushchevite revisionism can be seen in the next particular passage I want to read to you from Stalin. I could just read the whole thing, but that would get rather boring. So the way in which he explains the problem comes in the next quotation, which reads as follows. The bureaucrats have long become past masters in the art of demonstrating their loyalty to party and government decisions in words and pigeonholing them in deed. In order to overcome these difficulties, it was necessary to put an end to the disparity between our organizational work and the requirements of the political line of the party. It was necessary to raise the level of organizational leadership in all spheres of the national economy to the level of political leadership. It was necessary to see to it that our organizational work guarantees the practical realization of the political slogans and decisions of the party. In order to overcome these difficulties and achieve success, it was necessary to organize the struggle to eliminate these difficulties. It was necessary to draw the masses of the workers and peasants into this struggle. It was necessary to mobilize the party itself. It was necessary to purge the party and the economic organizations of unreliable, unstable, and demoralized elements. And again, he then goes on to extensively set out a series of conditions that need to be met in order to struggle against bureaucratism, in order to struggle against what he called the pigeonholing of the party's decisions. And again, this is actually something when I was reading through it, I was reminded a little bit of certain things that I have read from Xi Jinping in his anti-corruption struggle. But we'll come to such comparisons later on, because there's virtue in making them, but there's also drawbacks in making them. So he goes on to state 14 points that need to be fulfilled in order to properly struggle against bureaucratism and red tapeism, as he puts it. One of the things, and this is crucial to, again, understanding what is going on here, which is that he says that the party has to organize extensive self-criticism and exposure of defects. So being able to actually expose problems, but also forcing people to recognize their own errors. And self-criticism gets mocked a lot by liberals and Trotskyites because they hate the idea of accountability, basically. And I have mentioned this in the episodes I've done on Trotsky. Trotsky, for all that he likes to portray himself as the great romantic revolutionary, actually comes closer to being more of a sort of much more of the authoritarian madman that he portrays Stalin as being than Stalin ever was. Trotsky always liked to hide behind ultra-left slogans, but when he was actually in power, ran his various offices like, as Stalin once observed in the 1920s in the struggle against Trotsky, he always viewed the socialism as a Prussian-style top-down operation. He hid this behind ultra-left slogans, but his actual method of political management was always had much more in common with Bismarck than it did with Lenin. So Trotskyites, liberals, bureaucrats hate the idea of self-criticism and exposure of defects. Why? Again, these people all hate the idea and the reality of the consistent involvement of the masses in the state, which is what Stalin is calling for here, and indeed what the successes of the 5-year plans were fundamentally based on. There's a lot that went into the 5-year plans, obviously, so I'm somewhat abstracting a little bit to make a point, but it is the fact that the masses were not only directly involved in the shaping of the 5-year plans and in carrying them out, but they knew that they were, and they understood and embraced their role within that. That's the crucial thing to bear in mind. So he also mentions how you need to mobilize the masses of the workers and the peasants to fight for the application of the slogans and the decisions of the party and the government. And often you need to mobilize them against the bureaucratic machine that represented the party and the government. And this comes out in studies done by by even Western academics now of the process of struggle in the 1930s, that often the workers in factories and peasants in collective farms would mobilize against a factory manager or a collective farm manager, and would essentially be able to remove them by criticizing them properly, by saying that you have not fulfilled your obligations under the production plan, you are not running this factory in a way that accords with the building of socialism, etc., etc. And of course, a lot of these like ineffectual and useless fucking factory managers and collective farm managers who were forced out by votes taken and by the workers in those factories and in those farms absolutely hated this. Many of them who'd got into trouble were the ones who were like the first big time defectors from the Soviet Union to the West, and often came with absolute horror stories. Oh my God, I was chased out of my position, etc. But what it comes down to in actual fact is the fact that for a lot of these people, that bourgeois and petty bourgeois mentalities persisted. So the idea of them being accountable to the workers in the enterprise that they managed was a horror to these people. And again, Stalin and Lenin before him are very clear that bourgeois and petty bourgeois tendencies within certainly like layers of management, in certain layers of the skilled working class, in former members of the old ruling class who were still present, even if they carried a party card, even if they committed themselves to the building of socialism, those tendencies in the mind, in the consciousness, they all still existed. And it's hard to get rid of those. I mean, you know it yourself. If you're born and raised in a certain environment, especially if it's an environment which encourages you to see yourself as separate from or above the working class, it's hard to get rid of that. It's a struggle to purge yourself of those tendencies. How many people do we all know, all of you who are watching this stream right now, who you've known in your personal or professional life, who are avowed whatevers, Maoists, Marxist-Leninists, Trotskyites, Social Democrats, who will all swear with their hands on their hearts that they want to see socialism in their lifetimes, that they're the biggest Marxists that you could possibly meet. Maybe they've read all of Marx, maybe they could quote bits of Capital to you, but when it comes down to it, what actually is their attitude to the masses? And if their attitude to the masses is one of hatred and contempt, which is what you find in a lot of these people, in many different countries, especially in the imperialist countries, but I know that there are people on the stream now who are watching this from non-imperialist countries, so maybe your experience differs, I don't know. But what you find in a lot of places, a lot of political groupings, inside Britain especially, and I know inside the United States, Canada, etc., is that all these big-time left-wingers who come from petty bourgeois or even upper working class backgrounds, who go to university, who regard themselves as superior to the masses, their contempt and their loathing for the masses comes out. It comes out in the most unexpected of ways. And so to go back to what Stalin is writing about here, Stalin is a man who comes from the peasantry. His father was a former serf who'd been a shoemaker, who had briefly run his own small business, but through bad economic luck and through a recession and also through his own alcoholism, his father lost that business and died penniless, drunk in Tbilisi in 1909. And no one even knows where his father's grave is. The Georgian Soviet Republic tried to find it in the 1970s, and they believe that they found roughly where it is, but the man was buried in a pauper's grave. Stalin's mother, of course, lived much longer into the middle 1930s, but he was a man of the masses. He was a man who was born into if some of the lowest layers of the Georgian masses. So he knew what it was like to be dirt poor. He knew what it was like to be raised by an alcoholic and apparently very violent father. He knew what being homeless meant, because there was a period in time in Stalin's early life where the family had to move from various different addresses because they had no permanent home of their own, because his father's shoemaking business had failed. Incidentally, the example that Stalin gives in the work Anarchism or Socialism about how consciousness changes, he says he uses the example of a man who goes from being a individual tradesman, that of a cobbler, to working in a shoe factory, and that it takes a while for his consciousness to change. The inspiration there clearly comes from the life of his own father. So the point is that Stalin's a man who is immersed in within the Georgian and wider Russian masses. His earliest experiences are in organizing strikes in what was then called Tiflis, now Tbilisi, and that's his defining political characteristic. It's what stays with him through his entire life. His appreciation of and genuine love for the great masses of the Soviet Union. And now there's plenty of people who come from exactly that background, who fall in love with a life of privilege and come to loathe their own origins. But Stalin never did. And Stalin understood that one of the biggest dangers of the building of socialism in the Soviet Union was that there would be this layer that was going to develop, that was going to be hostile to the masses and their role. And unfortunately, it is that layer that was able to emerge more confidently. There was a struggle that went on in the later 1940s between the Stalin group and that layer. Ultimately, that layer hid itself to a certain extent, disguised itself. And Khrushchev is a big example of this, because there was no bigger promoter of what Khrushchev later denounced as the cult of personality than Khrushchev himself. He was a groveler. He was an opportunist. He was always somebody who was ready to sing the praises of the genius Comrade Stalin. But then again, he was the first to turn on Stalin when Stalin died. So again, an opportunist, a man in love with the belief in his own genius, despite the fact that none of his actions clearly merited the title of genius, and a man who was, because he was an opportunist, was constantly seeking easy answers. So Stalin emphasizes throughout the rest of this speech, which has become a pamphlet, the way in which the decisions made in the 5-year plan have to be consistently chased and consistently pushed and consistently looked at in terms of how to implement them properly. That is a matter of the fact that without that you're going to get a collapse into bureaucratism. Without the consistent involvement in the masses, a collapse into like red tapeism, bureaucratism, opportunism will come. And again, this is exactly what happens in the middle to later 1950s. So I will just read to you a couple of other parts of this, which I think are crucial in terms of bringing an understanding of this. And he gives a very amusing sort of dramatization of a way in which bureaucratism emerges. So he he talks about one form of bureaucratism. So I'll give the first example of this to start off with. He says, apart from the incorrigible bureaucrats and red tapists as to whose removal there are no differences of opinion among us, there are two other types of executives who retard our work, hinder our work, and hold up our advance. One of these types of executives is represented by people who rendered certain services in the past, people who have become aristocrats, who consider that party decisions and the laws issued by them, by the Soviet government, are not written for them, but for fools. These are the people who do not consider it their duty to fulfill the decisions of the party and of the government, and who thus destroy the foundations of the party and state discipline. Well, who does that sound like? If you read accounts, even by anti-communists, of the way in which the discipline of the party slowly collapsed from the 50s onwards, you can see that this is exactly who ended up in charge. So you get Khrushchev, who considers himself to be the great man, who considers himself to be above the masses, who considers he and his leadership group to be geniuses, whose wisdom must be appreciated, and who sees no role for the masses in the building of socialism anymore. A bureaucrat, basically, but also people who had convinced themselves that they were above being held to account by the masses, were actually pathologically hostile to it. And that's where you get people like, well, coming in later years in the Brezhnev era, people like Yakovlev, who would become the head of propaganda under Gorbachev, people like Gorbachev himself, people like Primakov, and others who emerged in the 70s and the 80s, who are like the absolute manifestation of this. We are the superior ones. The rules do not apply to us. The rules are there for the workers to follow. We, the great masters of the state, are not bound by these rules. That's why we are obsessed with smuggling in Western goods and indulging in speculations on the black market and being as corrupt as possible. That's who he's referring to, because Stalin knew who these people were, or what kind of people these were, and the dangers they posed to the system, and that there was a remedy for this, which is that the system needed to be constantly purged of these people. Now, of course, there was the great purges of the 1930s, which we will go into if there's a demand for it in other episodes, but in every system, the realization made by Lenin, taken further by Stalin and Mao, in every system that has been successful, the struggle against this type of character that Stalin is identifying here has been crucial. Ask yourself this: why is it that the DPRK has survived when all the other people's democracies and the Soviet Union itself disappeared? Why is it that a country that is isolated, surrounded by imperialist proxies, the occupied South, the imperialist proxy that is Japan, or the hostile capitalist Russia in the 90s, admittedly not hostile anymore, but certainly for a long time it was, when it was becoming a puppet of US imperialism. Why is it that they were able to survive when the people's democracies of Eastern Europe were not, when the Soviet Union itself imploded? And the answer, of course, lies in the fact that both, not just the paramount leaders in terms of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, not just them, but the wider party leadership of the Workers' Party of Korea understood this lesson. If you go back and you look at Kim Il-sung's work, which you can find online, again, he constantly emphasizes that the need for a struggle against these elements, and against these, against arrogance, against petty corruption, which leads to much bigger corruption, against those who see themselves as above, divorced, and apart from the masses. That's a struggle that Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il both constantly emphasized needed to be waged, along with the cultural struggle. That's the other element of this. But Stalin goes on to do a sort of very witty example of like what he describes as windbags. So I'll read this whole thing to you because I think it's instructive and it's quite funny. And now, says Stalin, about the second type of executives. I have in mind the windbags. I would say honest windbags, people who are honest and loyal to the Soviet government, but who are incompetent as executives, incapable of organizing anything. Last year I had a conversation with one such comrade, a very respected comrade, but an incorrigible windbag, capable of drowning any living cause in a flood of talk. Here is the conversation. Stalin, how are you getting on with the sowing? That's the sowing of seeds. The comrade, with the sowing, Comrade Stalin, we have mobilized ourselves. Stalin, well, and what then? The comrade in question, we have put the question squarely. And what next? There is a turn, Comrade Stalin. Soon there will be a turn. But still, we can say that there is an indication of some progress. But for all that, how are you getting on with the sowing? So far, Comrade Stalin, we have not made any headway with the sowing. So, Stalin goes on to say, here you have the physiognomy of the windbag. They have mobilized themselves. They have put the question squarely, but they have made a turn and some progress, but things remain as they were. So, what point is Stalin making there? Seems rather obvious, but I would say that it goes back to the way in which he opened this particular contribution that he's making, which is that there, in the system there were those who were essentially people who were incapable, for various different reasons, of properly implementing the plans that had been laid out, who had no real interest in doing it, who were box tickers, who were those who evaded the responsibility they had to the masses, to the party and the state, who thought that just by going through the motions they could have an easy life for themselves. So what you see here is that Stalin and the revolutionaries who were with him in his leadership period, they had a very keen understanding of the weaknesses that were there in the Soviet state and in the party. And again, they knew the only way to remedy this was through the direct intervention of the masses over and over and over again. So let's go back to why People's Korea has survived. They've survived and have, to a certain extent, started to even prosper in certain areas because they absorbed this lesson, because Kim Il-sung absorbed this lesson. And they would not have survived for 5 minutes after 1991 had they not been, since the early 50s and all the way through, consistently waging this struggle against the incompetent and arrogant and bureaucratic elements. Now, what Khrushchev did by, again, relegating the role of the masses, seeing himself as above them, seeing the process of struggle as needing to be closed off, for various different reasons, and all those that went with him, is that they unleashed all of these elements that Stalin correctly says were holding back the struggle for socialist advance. He let them off the hook and allowed them to run riot in various different ways. First of all, by denigrating and downgrading the role of the masses in the ongoing revolutionary process, but also by introducing such things as market relations, doing away with large elements of the planned economy, introducing capitalist methods of production, which allowed these elements to essentially make more money on the side, allowing them to cheat more on their production quotas. And Khrushchev, and this is where we go back to Alexander Galushka's statement that we opened the program with, Khrushchev realized at a certain point that he'd unleashed a tidal wave of corruption and chaos by doing this, and then tried to reverse course. But as he was a bureaucrat and a fool, he didn't realize the way to reverse course. It never occurred to him to mobilize the masses, of course. So what he tried to do when he realized that this plan of his had essentially started to institutionalize corruption was that he came up with this idea that, well, if I just move the bureaucrats around every few years, then the problem will be solved. A bureaucrat solution to a bureaucratic problem, if you will. So he came up with this idea that if I just keep moving the various different office holders around, then it will prevent them from taking root and engaging in corrupt practices. So this basically just created a lot of chaos, as Galushka says, in the public administration. And again, like it typifies everything about Khrushchev, which is that he's always seeking an easy and bureaucratic answer. He never looks, and none of the rest of them did either, all the way up to Gorbachev. They never looked or wanted to reignite the role of the masses in the revolutionary process. And as Kieran and Kenny point out in their book, Socialism Betrayed, once Khrushchev relegates the role of the masses, social problems such as alcoholism re-emerge. Why? Well, because to get into Hegelian territory for a moment, the spirit that animates the Stalin period, what is it more than anything else? Again, it's this consistent involvement of the masses on a countrywide scale in the governing and the formation of plans, in the running of the country, in the implementation of plans, the intervention of the masses as mobilized by the party against corrupt and bureaucratic elements. So this is the reason why, and to get back to the reason why Stalin is hated so much, this is why. It's not just that the successes of the 5-year plans and the building of socialism terrified these bastards in the imperialist countries, but it is because he understood the role of the masses in the revolutionary process, but also how the masses must be consistently mobilized in the fight for socialism. That the fight for socialism doesn't just end when the red flag goes up the pole and the old flag gets hauled down. When you declare it to be socialism, as he says in that in the opening part of this speech that I've just read to you from, Stalin had a properly dialectical understanding of the process of building socialism, which of course goes against Trotsky's cliched nonsense about Stalin being an idiot, which of course Khrushchev plagiarized from Trotsky and turned into his speech. So who are Stalin's enemies? Who are the ones who seek to denigrate and defame Stalin the most? Why? It's bureaucrats. It's those people he's talked about in this speech. The yes men, the office, the placeholders, the high office seekers, those who see themselves as above and superior to the working class, those who see no role for the working class, those who denigrate the worker. Those are the people who are the enemies of Stalin internally inside the USSR, and of course the imperialists are the enemies of Stalin outside the USSR, which is why there's still a major industry devoted to the pursuit of or the perpetuating of the lies and propaganda about Stalin. That's why, because the people who are the enemies of socialism in the imperialist countries, they really understood the strengths of Stalin and the Stalin period. There's no industry devoted to the denunciation of Khrushchev. There's no industry devoted to the denunciation of Brezhnev. In fact, for Gorbachev, there's an industry devoted to still singing his praises. And after all, why wouldn't they? So the bourgeoisie understood very clearly what Khrushchevite revisionism meant. And that was, of course, a tragic betrayal of the revolutionary process carried out by a fool at the instigation of a combination of poorly educated buffoons who imagined themselves to be great leaders and, of course, active traitors to socialism in the Soviet hierarchy. And it is this which we must come back to, the difference between a social democrat and a revolutionary. The social democrat is fundamentally a bureaucrat. The social democrat believes socialism to be the product of his actions as a great individual leader of the working class who sees himself as above the working class. The revolutionary might see himself, or correctly, as the vanguard of the working class, or in the vanguard of the working class. But let's remember what Lenin said in What Is to Be Done, which is that he argues there that the vanguard is just literally the first part. Without the rest of the working class behind it, then the vanguard is just a small and isolated group, and that the vanguard cannot run too far ahead of the masses, nor should it lag behind, but should be constantly at the head of them, leading them forward. and that there needs to be this unity, constant unity between the vanguard and the masses. And this is true, especially, of course, in the period of the building of socialism. This connection needs to be fought for and maintained and developed constantly, and the masses constantly brought into a struggle to maintain socialism against external enemies, and also a consistent struggle against internal enemies, of which there are many, as Stalin correctly identifies here. And I'll just finish by saying once again that one of the things that Domenico Lazzardo correctly points out in his book on Stalin, which I've just got that finally got a printed hard copy of, that it's this. This is the crucial thing to actually understand in terms of the reason why Stalin is still so well regarded in the countries of the former Soviet Union, or many of the countries of the former Soviet Union. By who? By the masses, by the working class. The working class consistently in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus especially, but also the other countries too, and in Georgia, the working class never abandoned Stalin, because they understood what his role was. It's the social democrats, the liberals, the revisionists, the Trotskyites, the capitalists, of course. They are the ones who maintain the full-time industry to denigrate and destroy the achievements of the Stalin period, because they know what it represents. It is the tragedy that our own side has been underconfident in defending this. But again, if we now have the ability, thanks to the fact that the scholarship is there, now even in English, to actually properly defend this period and to answer confidently the lies of the CIA, MI6, and the imperialist press, which they still insist on telling. It is, of course, entirely understandable that they insist upon telling these lies. They serve their interests. The tragic and the criminal thing is that the communist parties, under the influence of Khrushchev and then under Trotskyism, indulged in all these lies themselves. And that's the thing that we, of course, need to get over. I'll now pause to take questions from the floor, so to speak. Right, where are we? We have various people who have joined us. So we've got Luca with us, Zuleika, Ross from the great port of Glasgow in Scotland, Peter, who is with us from the land of perfidious Albion, CJ, who's driving to work. We've got William Gordon Wright, who says, good evening from New Zealand. Good to have you with us. Bobby G says that I've been gradually Stalin pilling me. Well, excellent stuff. Harry said also naive with regard to Khrushchev. Yes, but education could have solved that. Ben Toff says, I had no idea you streamed during the day. Well, it's a bit of a one-off, but we may make it a permanent thing. Greetings from the former People's Republic of Hungary. Good to have you with us, Ben. Kedar spoke about self-criticism pretty much every other year. Is that Janos Kedar you're referring to there? Schrödinger's Katza says Trotsky equals right-winger wearing red. And Martin says Trotsky sounds like a Trotskyite. Indeed he was. Ben says Trotsky today would be a New York liberal, despised the masses, accountability, and adores the West. Well, where the Trotskyites ended up was entirely right, which is they all ended up supporting the color revolutions against the people's democracies, and of course enthusiastically endorsing Banderite Ukraine as well. Of course, says Ben, he was a New York liberal before the October Revolution. He shipped in from there. Dr. Ahmed says, at the moment of truth, he's referring to the petty bourgeois leftists, become elitist and self-righteous and argumentative and suck the revolutionary energy. Very true. Ben says, 100% Khrushchev was the biggest cult of personality cultivator before 1953. Albert says, it is difficult not to resent the working class, especially when they are constantly working against their own interests. Well, I would say that one has to refine one's thinking about that. Again, well, I said recently in a program about entitled The Ruthless Criticism of All That Exists, the first ruthless criticism has to be applied to ourselves. How many bourgeois tendencies do we have? How many unfortunate legacies of our upbringings do we carry with us? As to the working class consistently going against their own interest, well, the working class in Britain, I'm presuming you're from Britain, Albert, maybe you're not. The working class in Britain was one of the most militant in the Western world. It was defeated, and all its organisations and its leadership was destroyed by the early 1980s. Now, I was born in the early 1980s, so I and the generations that have followed us, the millennial generation, have grown up at a time when the bourgeoisie have had the unrestricted access to the airwaves to broadcast their victory. Everything that we have consumed as culture since our earliest years, those of us born since the late 70s, have everything we've consumed has been part of that victory. It's been produced by the victory of the bourgeoisie. It's been produced by the death of socialism. You're told all the way through your life that the answer is not class solidarity. The answer is for you as an individual to hustle your way out of being working class. That's what we're told. And so when you've got two generations that grow up and display that mentality to a certain extent, it's not surprising. It's a product of generations who grow up in the long shadows of defeat. Now, what we're looking at now is a realization creeping across people, more and more people, that they've been sold a whole bunch of lies for two generations. It's happening slowly, but it is there. So whenever one gets frustrated with the working class, bear in mind, first of all, turn the examination in upon yourself. And second of all, remember the context within which the working class live and operate, and the way in which the bourgeoisie has had two generations to ram home all of their propaganda. And the condition of the working class in England becomes more clear, or in the United States becomes more clear. And in the end, material reality will triumph. But again, whenever one is feeling frustrated with the class, examine yourself first, is my advice there. Hello to Ash, who's joined us. Ben says, if the Soviets cracked cybernetics, OGAS cancelled in the 70s, in Stalin's time, the bureaucracy would have been decimated as Stalin wanted. Yes, the Soviet computer-aided automation now, of course, could be closer than ever. But again, like the bureaucracy is a constant enemy. Stalin and Mao both appreciated that. Elisa wants a program on the purges. Dr. Ahmed said Khrushchev, was envious of Stalin because he's an opportunist, incompetent psychopath, same as that traitor Sadat was very envious of Nasser. Yes, the role of Sadat is something that I probably need to go into in a future program, but the more I find out about him, the worse he looks. One of truly the most despicable figures of 20th century history. A man who sold Egypt to imperialism very cheaply. A man who ultimately paid the price, but killed by a fundamentalist group that I believe he'd had some role in helping to start. Mary says, Stalin describing everyone in Westminster in 2024, and for a long time before that. People's Republic of Hungary had many such windbags, says Ben. Also, Yugoslavia did. Very true. Are there any good Stalin biographies? Yes. Don't know whether it counts as a biography, but books on Stalin, of course. You got the Lazardo book, which you should read, which is Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. You have Ludo Martin's Another View of Stalin, which I think you can get in an English translation. So those are two. Even the Isaac Deutscher version, biography of Stalin, actually isn't that bad, even though Deutscher was a Trotskyite. So those are several to get you going with. But the work done by Lazardo and Martins is good. The work done by Harpal Bra in his work on revisionism, Glasnost, the complete collapse of revisionism, Trotskyism or Marxist-Leninism. Those are two books to check out. As is, of course, the work done by, of course, reading the work of Stalin himself is a good antidote to this. to the endless bullshit about him. The work of Grover Furr in terms of his book Khrushchev Lied, which is a very thorough and lengthy debunking of all the claims that Khrushchev makes in the speech. So there's that, and all of Grover Furr's other work on all the major controversies of the Stalin period is also very much worth reading. Let's see, where do we go? Here. Right. Hello to Svetlana, who joins us. Ben says, and the era of historic nihilism, as the Chinese call it, began. CPGML created English subtitles for a Chinese documentary of the same name, by the way. Interesting. I haven't watched that yet. The USSR effectively died on March... Where are we? I've lost the comment there. March 5th, 1953. It was fatally damaged, certainly by 1956. There were various points, I would argue, that the process could have been turned around. But I think the entire leadership group was too... Even the ones who didn't want to collapse the Soviet Union, like... I don't think Brezhnev wanted to collapse the Soviet Union. I don't think Andropov did either. I don't think people like Yegor Ligachev did, or Rizkov did. Even and those were guys who were in the Gorbachev leading group. I don't think they wanted to see the Soviet Union end. I don't think that they wanted the outcome that ultimately emerged. That's the outcome that all of their actions got them, though. So let's be clear. But the fact is that all of them remain limited because none of them understand the key lesson that we've just spent the last hour talking about, which is that without, again, it goes back to the role of the masses. Without the consistent mobilization of the masses, then there is no fight for socialism. And this is a weakness, by the way, that remains there, certainly in the form of the Russian Communist Party. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation to this day remain sort of left Brezhnevites, basically, in that they don't see the necessity of the mobilization of the masses. They do some good things, which is they do ardently defend the Stalin period now, but again, like, comes back to the fact that even the more honest members of the Soviet leadership still retained all the flaws that Stalin's talking about in that piece I've just read from. Martin asks, what are your thoughts on Paul Cockshott? I've been watching some of his videos, and one of his points is that on mathematical grounds, central planning is more efficient than market mechanisms. I haven't had time to read his stuff yet, Martin. So when I have had time to read it and look at it, I will answer your question. Make sure you remind me of it if I don't get to it. I'll try and watch some of his stuff by the time of the Q&A on Sunday and respond to your question then. Greetings to Jerry, who's joined us. Ben says, this mass involvement and socialist positivism is represented perfectly in the 1936 Soviet movie Circus. Hungary translated the main theme lyrics. One of my favorite songs. Interesting. I'll have to keep a look out for that. Where are we now? Harry says there are once again calls to investigate Stalin's death. I've seen that called for on multiple occasions. I mean, I don't see, unless there's some kind of record in the Soviet archive from a note from Khrushchev saying I did it. I don't see how we can discover anything there. I mean, there may be something there. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I've seen speculation in Molotov's sort of semi-autobiography that he did with Felix Chuev. Molotov speculates there that various characters in the Soviet leadership might have had a motivation to kill him. It's difficult for me to say. I don't know. There's always been speculation that either Khrushchev might have had something to do with it, though Molotov thinks that Khrushchev wasn't capable of coming up with such a plot. Khrushchev clearly despises Beria and says that he might have had something to do with it. But again, Beria's also got his defenders in Marxist-Leninist circles. It's possible. I mean, there's speculation that Zhdanov was killed by somebody, by some pro-capitalist element. But Zhdanov suffered with heart problems due to excessive drinking, apparently. Stalin was a man in his middle 70s who was a big smoker and had had possibly the highest stress job in the world for 30 years. So again, that he would die of a stroke isn't beyond the realms of medical knowledge there. It isn't beyond the realms of the possible. But were there people around who would have wanted to see him dead? Absolutely. So again, like, is there something in the Soviet archive that could be released that could incriminate somebody? Maybe. If there is, then I hope that it is ultimately released. But I doubt that the current Russian government would have any motivation to release that. There's a lot of stuff from the Stalin period that remains sealed and isn't going to be released. And the answer and the question that we have to ask there is why? Given that in Khrushchev's time and certainly in Gorbachev's time and Yeltsin's and Putin's, to be honest, there's no restriction on the amount of dirt that can be poured over Stalin's name. So what is the stuff that remains classified? The answer is it's probably stuff that reveals that a lot of the shit that was said about Stalin, a lot of the shit that was said in defense of those the high profile men who were killed in the 30s in the purges, I think, it's probably stuff that proves their guilt rather than disproves it. It's probably stuff that proves what Grover Fair argues about the Katyn massacre is correct, that it was done by the Nazis, and then the Nazis tried to pin it on the Soviets. Just as, by the way, the intelligence networks of the US and the British pin Ukrainian massacres or Banderist massacres like Bucha on Russian forces. So this isn't exactly something which has gone away as a tactic. So again, let's see who's calling for it. Is there anything there to be released other than more speculation? But what is certainly true is that there was a struggle going on between the opportunists and the revolutionaries in the later 1940s, which is actually personified through battles over these textbooks on Soviet political economy and Stalin's last major intervention in print in terms of his work on economics. All of these show that there was a battle going on there, and also the attempts that were made by Khrushchev and Beria, I think, to make sure that Stalin remained isolated and remained unable to speak with the masses directly. That this was something that was clearly going on because they feared that Stalin was about to make an appeal to essentially mobilize the masses again against what I'm going to call like the social democratic and revisionist group. That was a fear that many of them had. So again, there's motivations there for various people to want to see him dead. But again, until we know something here, we're all just speculating. And in the book by Molotov, he's speculating as well. So we don't know for sure. Richard Madden says, this all sounds great, but I really can't see the masses of this country being mobilized. Most people view things individually and not collectively. They want to get rich. People are more complicated than that, Richard. I know this is negative thinking that we all fall into, but I've seen millions of people get mobilized for various different things. I've seen and been part of, even in a small way, mass mobilizations of workers 10 years ago, 13 years ago, in the massive strikes that were ultimately sold out by the TUC leadership of the public sector. In the anti-war movement, I've seen millions and millions of people get mobilized. Why do millions of people go out and demonstrate for Gaza every week? To answer your point, is it because they're getting something out of it? No. You're running the risk, as our great illustrious Prime Minister tells us, you're running the risk of arrest by going out and demonstrating for Gaza. So why do people do it? How does that fit in with the point of view that everybody just wants to get rich or views things individually? Clearly there's more at work here. People can have more than one thing going on in their consciousness at the same time. So it's like, we all fall into the thinking that, oh, the masses, they're never going to move, everything's fucked, etc., because that's the message that bourgeois propaganda hammers into our heads over and over and over again. But people are very contradictory. They'll do something self-interested and self-seeking one moment, and then do something out of an act of solidarity and collectivity the next. Like the working class, because it's pulled in different directions. It's pulled in one direction by the fact that it is the working class, in the direction of collective action constantly. They're pulled by bourgeois propaganda in another direction towards individualistic behavior and self-seeking. And because it's only the bourgeois who have had their propaganda being hammered into people's heads for 30 odd years now, maybe longer, that these behaviors occur more commonly. But the opposite side occurs as well. You see it in small ways. I mean, a comrade was saying to me the other day, you see the working class like building community support networks in areas where essentially state provided services have collapsed in Britain. Again, are they doing that out of self-interest, or are they doing that out of a sense of basic class solidarity? Like, people's behaviors are a lot more complex than the bourgeois propaganda wants to have us believe. And I have seen people in this country mobilize and start to see and believe that something could be better. And of course, the big barrier to that, those who immediately step in and smack that down, are the Labour Party leaders, are the trade union leaders, are the leaders, the so-called thought leaders of leftist academia. Those are the ones who are the biggest barrier to it. And the ones who are the most self-seeking, those who are the most obsessed with their own status, their own position and their own wealth, it's the people in the leadership positions. They're the worst. So, and again, go back to what Lenin said. Stop appealing to them. Go lower and deeper into the masses. And yes, you'll find people with all manner of contradictory sets of beliefs, contradictory states of consciousness. But you'll find the lower that you go into the working class, and the more deeply you go into the working class, the more elements of basic solidarity and basic acts of communal solidarity you will find there being constructed by them out of necessity. So your point of view is understandable, Richard. It's one that we've all felt from time to time, but I would ask that you take the time to step back and observe and interact with the complexity of working class existence in this particular period of time. Negative thinking is very easy to fall into. We have all done it. But again, we need to question our assumptions and actually more properly understand the way the working class lives at various different levels in this country. Ben says, Matyos Rákosi, father of Hungarian communism, refused to denounce Stalin, so he had to be stripped of power and died in the end in Moscow thanks to Khrushchev. Well, I'm not entirely surprised by that, to be completely honest. The events of Hungary in 1956 will be an interesting thing to visit on one of these streams. In actual fact, given that I've seen things before, videos and some written material about the fact that Rákosi's removal was part of the process which triggered the road to the events of 1956. So we'll come back to that. Let's move forward. Trying to keep up with all the comments here. Svetlana says, my family were liberated from dirt poor peasantry thanks to Stalin. They went on to become officers in the Red Army. Very good point about who gained from the Stalin period and who didn't. HSD says, greetings from the Imperial Outpost of Australia, where a group of Sydney lawyers have written to the ICC asking that our Prime Minister be investigated for complicity in the genocide in Gaza. Very properly. Mr. Albanese is a criminal and should be treated as such. Ben says, my granddad was a coal and uranium miner. When the Soviets liberated Hungary, he returned in great esteem and comfort. His daughter became a teacher. What do you mean by bureaucratic state machine? Luca, are you asking me that question? The Bureaucracy, generally speaking, refers to those who are in permanent positions. So state servants, civil service, you would call it in Britain. In terms of the Soviet state, it's those who are employees of the state, who are appointed rather than elected. So that's bureaucracy. That's my shorthand way of explaining it. State machine, of course, refers to not just the bureaucracy, but also the entire edifice of the state. So it's civil service being one of it, it's state employees being part of it, the armed forces being part of it. The entire apparatus of the state is what I'm referring to by state machine there. Finnish Bolshevik has a good series of programs on the purges. Good point. They're very much worth watching. Another Stalin is the best book, says Svetlana, by Yuri Zhukov, only in Russian, alas, I think. Well, thanks for the recommendation. I'll have to keep an eye on that. Dr. Ahmed says it'd be a pleasure, according to Martin's suggestion, to be interviewed. We'll have to look at that. I'd love to expose Sadat, who called himself the hero of war and peace. Sadat seems to be a very vain and stupid man. A sort of Egyptian Khrushchev, really. Svetlana says the Gorbachev fan club in the West is certainly not here in Russia. He's generally despised. Yes, very true. Right. Trying to catch up with the comments here. Andrew says, okay, Zuleika says, in agreement apparently with me, people can have more than one thing going on in their consciousness. Yes, very true. Sean says, we live in grand times. We alive in grand times were correct. Theory is corresponding with a rise in working class consciousness. Andrew says, hi, comrade. I learned so much from you. Thank you. Your show is very important, very informative too. Thank you for all your posts. They're very educational. Well, glad you're getting something out of it. HSD says, or asks, do you follow Australian politics at all? I find it hard to see our Labour Party, poor as they are, as being entirely as despicable as our Conservative Party. Well, I follow it slightly, and your Labour Party, HSD, were the ones who instituted the assault on the Australian working class that was picked up and taken further by John Howard. So everything that John Howard did has its roots in things that Bob Hawke did. And the Australian Labour Party is like the last element of its political independence was crushed when they removed, the British and the Americans staged their coup to remove Gough Whitlam in the early 1970s. So that any remaining independent element there disappeared 50 years ago. The Australian Labour Party, well, it might not be as obnoxious as like Scott Morrison or whichever the hell clown is leading the Liberals these days, but what are the genuine differences between the Australian Liberals and the Australian Labour Party? Given that the continuity from Hawke to Keating to Howard and ultimately to Kevin Rudd is the same as our continuity from Wilson to Callaghan to Thatcher to Major to Blair to Brown to Cameron. When it comes to the fact that the assault on the Australian working class is consistent, no matter which party has its name above the door of the Parliament as being in power, well then what is the fundamental difference? Given that it seems to me that if Bob Hawke led an assault on the Australian welfare state and helped to destroy it and attacked the Australian working class and led directly to the time of John Howard, then how is Bob Hawke or Paul Keating any better than John Howard? If you have an alternative point of view, I would be glad to hear it. But it seems to me that the Australian Labour Party is basically like a spin-off of our Labour Party, which is that it's a despicable imperialist party and an enemy of the working class and needs to be treated as such. Andrew says, can you name any books that Stalin wrote? Foundations of Leninism being one, his book on the national question being another. A lot of the books by, I mean, his collected works, obviously, which you can find a hell of a lot of useful stuff in there. There's also the book On the Opposition, which is a collection of writings. So, and there's his book on dialectical and historical materialism with Andrew, which is one of the best introductions to it. You can find all these on the Marxist Internet Archive, which you can get access to them all for free on there if you are prepared to read online. Muniz says, People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies recently had a great episode on the 56 quote-unquote revolution. Very true, very good point. From Muniz, Zuleika says, this idea that the masses are single-minded can be so chauvinistic. Richard, not directed at you, but I'm sick of radlibs demanding workers accept transhumanism because it's progressive like socialism. Well, radlibs are fucking morons, so best to be dismissed, really. Combina says, Blur drummer became Labour candidate, says it all. Yeah. Yeah. Blur, shit band, shit politics. Not a surprise that one of them got involved with the Labour Party at all. Schrodinger's Katza says Lula's government in Brazil is right now is pretty bad. I haven't been keeping up to it, but I see there were significant problems with the PT government 10 years ago. I mean, they opened the door to their own defeat by Bolsonaro, really. Remember that Michel Temer, the man who benefited from the constitutional coup against Dilma Rousseff, was Dilma Rousseff's vice president because they wanted to do a deal with the Brazilian bourgeois. The Brazilian bourgeois, of course, are being pulled in two directions. Part of them wants to be continue to be total compradors for the USA. Some of them seem to want to build relations with the Chinese, especially. But many of them are, of course, still opposed to even the moderate version of Lula that's there at the moment. And of course, the danger, as it always is with social democrats, even in a non-imperialist country like Brazil, is that what they do is that they make compromises with the bourgeoisie, they demobilize and alienate their own supporters, and then the bourgeoisie defeats them because their own supporters have become demoralized. Same picture everywhere. Again, that is the reason why I elevate people like Maduro and Ortega above someone like Lula, because Maduro and Ortega embraced the role of the masses in ongoing revolutionary process. Lula and the PT don't. The Kirchnerists in Argentina never did. And that's why both of them, both of the latter groups, have been defeated. HSD says, actually, no, I've missed a comment here. Can you give evidence as your take on Lenin's testament? The evidence suggests it's a total fake to me. Well, whatever the virtue of the writing of the testament, I mean, there's a strong argument made by Grover Furr that it's all faked. Regardless of that, what the Trotskyites claim essentially that Lenin left Trotsky the USSR in his will. That's essentially what they're claiming. That Trotsky should have been given the leadership of the USSR because he was some sort of great genius, which, by the way, he wasn't, and because Lenin basically bequeathed leadership to Trotsky in his last writings. This is nonsense. I mean, even if the last testament is true, what was it? It was the product of a dying man who was isolated and who was in a state of incredible frustration that he was leaving this world and was unable to do what he correctly saw as his life purpose anymore, which is his contribution into leading the fight for the building of socialism. And so that the Trotskyites take that, even if that last piece of writing is genuine, and elevate it to essentially a legal document which leaves the Soviet Union to the great hero Trotsky, well then, that's a joke. That's not a serious piece of analysis or critique. That's essentially revealing the politics of Trotsky, which is that he is a opportunist, that he views things in very bureaucratic terms, and he thinks that he should have just been given the leadership role. and that he shouldn't have had to prove himself, that he shouldn't have had to fight for anything. So my point about Trotsky is that he's an ill-disciplined, bureaucratic, petty bourgeois schemer. And the Trotskyites' embrace of the so-called testament of Lenin shows that they personify all of those tendencies as well. HSD says the Labour Party is slightly more progressive, you're referring to the Australian Labour Party, slightly more progressive tax policies, makes proposals such as the future tax, a proposed tax on extracted minerals which was thwarted by our oligarchs. I would say that the Labour Party under Ed Miliband in this country made so-called progressive points. They were still imperialists, though, and they were still, when it came down to it, rabid enemies of the working class. Look, I know that I'm not in Australia, obviously. You can judge by the accent, and you are. But the point I make to people in this country who talk about our Labour Party in ways that you're doing here is as follows. Get over the idea that they're better. They're not. Again, if they're any better, why is it so easy for the Australian Liberal national coalitions to follow them and make very few changes? Like, forget the nice things that they say. What is their actual role? The actual role of the Australian Labour Party is the same as the role the British Labour Party plays. At best, they represent a Labour aristocracy. At worst, they're as bitter enemies of the working class as the Liberals are. Like, they make all these nice proposals, and yes, you say that they did some Keynesian stuff during the global financial crisis. Well, so did the George W. Bush government in the United States. You say you find it hard to see them as the equivalent to the Liberals. They're in partnership with the Liberals, just as the British Labour Party is the left punch to the right punch of the Conservatives here, just that the Democrats are in the United States. Forget this idea that they're better. They're not. They're part of the same trap that the ruling class now makes for the working class. They're part of the same management system. They'll offer you the right fist one day and the left fist the next. Which one do you want to get hit in the face by? I say neither. Now, and this isn't just I'm not just singling out you. This is directed at everybody who still thinks that the social democratic parties are any better. They are not. Keir Starmer will be as ruthless an enemy of the British working class as Rishi Sunak is. He will be a more effective enemy because he has control over the trade union bureaucratic leadership. I am fairly sure I'm right in saying that the Australian Labour Party has a similar relationship to the Australian trade union hierarchy, which will be used by Albanese, or whoever succeeds him, to crush Australian working class struggle in the same way that the British Labour Party crushes or tries to crush British working class struggles using that bureaucratic relationship with the trade union leaders. So get over this idea that because they make some comments about Keynesianism every now and again, that these people are any better. They're as much of an enemy to socialist progress, to the progress towards socialism, as your liberals are. Forget what they say, look what they do. And also the fact that the Australian ruling class might grumble about the Australian Labour Party, the same way the British ruling class grumbles about our Labour Party. But fundamentally, they're a crucial part of state management here, and they have been in both Australia and in Britain for over 100 years. The capitalism in Britain and Australia couldn't have survived without the Labour parties in both our countries. Think of it that way. Song 2, says Lisa, reminds me of when my kids were kids, and Song 2 reminds me of when I was about 14. I liked it when I was 14. Now it feels just feels fucking awful. Like, all the stuff I listened to when I was a teenager, all the Britpop shit, is unlistenable now. And I think it was unlistenable then as well. I tried to go back and listen to Oasis. My God. I mean, you can see the degeneration in British culture in the degeneration in so-called popular music. Like there was like a high period in probably like from the 60s, middle 60s to the middle 80s, perhaps, or early 80s. But after that, it's just a complete fucking degeneration. like bad. To paraphrase a line from Fight Club, a copy of a copy of a copy. Dreck, awful shit. Ben says Valentina Tereshkova joined United Russia Party. Always breaks my heart. Well, that's what happens when the counter-revolution triumphs, Ben. Dan Kovalik's joined us and is enjoying the show. Good to have you with us, Dan. And Kombina says, Alexander, do you have talks or opinion about Dimitrov or Todor Zivkov? Todor Zivkov I don't know enough about, to be honest. So I'm not going to comment on the Zivkov era when I haven't researched it properly. I think Georgy Dimitrov, though, made absolutely some immortal contributions to Marxist-Leninist thought. His work on fascism, for instance, his defense of himself in the trial he was put through in Nazi Germany. I'm not as familiar with the early period of the People's Democracy period in Bulgaria, which he was involved with, but I will take a look at that. When Ian Foster says, when has a Labour politician advocated the repeal of any anti-trade union laws? Never. They are our class enemies and seek only to serve imperialism. Very true. Lertis says, do you include the Manics in that? Some thought in there. Which period are we talking about here? I think that the earlier Manic Street Preachers stuff has something going on, has some stuff going on in it. So like without wanting to come across as like a cliched Richie Edwards fan or something, like the earlier stuff like has some spirit to it, which makes it still listenable. Like Motorcycle Emptiness, I think is still a good song. That's still got an interesting vibe to it. Like the Holy Bible stuff, some of that stuff comes across as a bit adolescent, but there's a certain power to it which makes it still worth engaging with. After that, though, pretty much no. Like I know everybody loves Everything Must Go, but I never did. It's like they just went a bit U2 after that, to be honest. Even though, of course, none of them, to be fair, have ever become as annoying as Bono. What you find in like a lot of the lyrics of these sort of left-ish bands in Britain is like they all follow like the pattern of the Clash, which is like it's some good ideas politically in there, but a lot of dross. Remember that the song Washington Bullets by the Clash, the lyrics by Strummer, where he says a load of like really interesting things about Washington providing bullets to the Contras, and then says, find an Afghan peasant that the Moscow bullets missed, ask him what he thinks of voting communist. Proving that the ambassador's son couldn't quite rid himself of his class origins, shall we say. Speaking of Fight Club, did Tyler Durden embody the proper revolutionary spirit required by our times? You know what, HSD, I am gonna have to review Fight Club. It was a foundational movie for me in many respects, so I think it's only right that I go back to it. So stay tuned for that one. Sid Hatfield says, I can only listen to classic rock anymore, but we're foolish to think that CIA, FBI, DIA aren't behind almost all popular culture in the US and elsewhere. They have a much bigger role than I appreciated when I was a kid, but I think the biggest relation of all is the market relation. Like, though CIA and intelligence agency intervention into cultural trends, of course, is a huge thing, as it turns out. Remember, all the things they said were true about the Soviet Union were far more true about their own interventions. Remember, the whole concept of a Manchurian candidate was basically like a giant cope by the intelligence services in the West to cover up the fact that many of the men who'd been taken prisoner by the Koreans had converted to communism, quite genuinely, just by being given books to read by the Koreans. And it's like the whole MK Ultra program is fascinating because like it's like a bourgeois attempt to recreate that by brainwashing, by doing genuinely horrific things, dosing people up on fucking massive amounts of LSD or something, and then trying to like give them trigger words and brainwashing them. or trying to turn them into assassins. I mean, there's the story that I saw, it was on an episode of Rogan, Joe Rogan, which I do watch every now and again, where he's talking to a journalist about the Charles Manson murders and how Manson himself might have been part of some sort of MK Ultra experiment. There's consistent stories that the Unabomber, old Ted Kaczynski, might have had like MK Ultra type experiments done on him at university. And yes, there's a heavy. What you realize is that where the intelligence agencies end and the what's called like civil society or the entertainment industry or the academia, world of academia begins, that line is very blurred in capitalism. And the longer you go on, the longer you move around the world and you observe things, the more you can see the direct intervention of the agents of the state in these different spheres over and over again. So again, like they say that, oh, the KGB had people everywhere. They were designing everything. No, that's you. You know, that's you, because you have to have agencies of the state in every single institution to make sure that these institutions remain completely under control. The market relation does that. The wage relation does that quite a lot of the time. But there's always got to be agents of the state in there cracking the whip and making sure that nothing deviates. There is nothing more stifling. There is no atmosphere more stifling, more reactionary, and more conservative than bourgeois academia. And that's partly because of the class that it serves being the ruling class, but also because there are people who are direct agents of the state in there giving a certain political line. They're not James fucking Bond or anything, but they're people who go to the think tanks, who go to the seminars, who get briefings from state officials, who get told what to push and what to say. Guy, greetings to you. Sid says, I'm currently reading that book, Chaos by Tom O'Neill. If you know anything about covert ops, that book will blow your mind. It appears almost everyone in Hollywood are operatives. Yeah, the whole Hollywood machine thing turns out to be very much integrated with the American state. And why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't it be? The people who run the American bourgeois state understand the power of culture within their system and have always understood that. That's why it's still so well funded to this day, even though a lot of what they produce are loss-making pieces of crap. So, Potted Rodent says, Doug Valentine's books on the CIA are a good source on the agency, if not utterly depressing. Something to read in the future. Okay, right, we are hitting going up to the 2-hour mark. So I'm going to draw this program entitled Stalin Vindicated to a close for today. Tune in later on for a program on the resignation of the unlamented Victoria Nuland, which we'll be doing later today. So thank you to everybody who's contributed to a very interesting chat so far. Always good to have your questions, and be sure to join me later on for the program on the Ukraine war. Thank you for joining me. Now back over to the music.